Okay, 20 July 2025. Welcome to Weekly Marks. Today we're going to continue looking at texts, essays on Volume 3 of Marx's Capital, a text edited by Shepard and Rutten on the culmination of capital. And this is Martha Campbell's Rent and Landed Property, which I mislabeled, and I'll have to go back in and fix that. But it is chapter 10. And at 3 o'clock, about 58 minutes from now, I'm going to switch over to, I will end, however abruptly, and go over to Anand Hussein's struggle session, Sunday struggle session, and we'll try and transfer that into the Autonomous Collective Zoom. So needless to say, this may end early or abruptly. For Marx of the contribution, that is the contribution to critique of political economy, the theory of rent is to resolve the apparent contradiction between the labor theory of value and the existence of prices for commodities that are not products. When Marx considers rent in Part 6 of Capital, Volume 3, he does explain how the price of land is derived, but he defines his overall purpose in other terms. His aim is to spell out the specific relationships of production and exchange that arise from the investment of capital on land. These being part of the analysis of capital, and more narrowly, consider these only insofar as a portion of the surplus value that capital produces falls to the share of the landowner. There is a shift in emphasis between these two accounts. In the contribution, Marx is occupied with correcting a problem in the classical theory of value. In Capital, by contrast, he underscores his principal difference from classical theory, that is, the idea of capitalism as constituted by specific social relations of production, and of these as the source of economic laws. The difference is central to Part 6 of Volume 3. In Ricardo's account, the natural characteristics of land, that is, the original and indestructible powers of the soil, as he calls them, are the ultimate determinants of rent. Together with the natural law of population, they determine the long-term course of rent, and so of profit and of accumulation. In Marx's alternative, the source of rent is instead the economic power that ownership of non-capital can exert against capital. The powers of the soil influence the extent of this power, but they are largely not original and are significant not by themselves, but relative to the techniques of production. In place of population growth, the process of technological innovation inherent in capital, and so capital's nature, so to speak, determines the course of rent over time. As the power of ownership is to occupy center stage, the proper point of entry into Marx's theory of rent is with landed property. Part 1, landed property in the context of capitalism. By landed property, Marx means specifically the individual private ownership of land such that land is accorded all the characteristics of a commodity. That is, it is inalienable and has a price. Historically, landed property emerges from the original accumulation as the counterpart of wage labor, the demise of traditional modes of land use, and their replacement by private ownership, freeing one segment of society from the possession of any objective means of production. Thus, landed property guarantees that labor power will be available for capital to purchase, and as a result, is essential both for the historical emergence and perpetuation of capitalism. Apart from this, The characteristic feature of landed property is that it does nothing. Marx describes it as superfluous and completely passive. Now, by this, he means that landowners do not participate in or contribute to the development of capitalist production, but merely seize part of this resulting surplus. This differentiates landed property both from the other classes in capitalism and from its own place prior to capitalism. Landed property becomes passive with the transition to capitalism, since surplus is then based on the relation of capital to wage labor instead of the control of land, and profit is then the normal or dominant form of surplus instead. By the claim that rent presupposes profit, therefore, Marx means both that the subordinate status of rent is distinctive of capitalism, and also that rent in the modern sense is an excess over and above the average profit. Now, although Marx speaks of landed property as one of the three great classes of modern society, it seems odd that a class that is characterized by inaction could be necessary. Hence, Marx entertains the suggestion made by James Mill that capitalism could function just as well with state as well as individual ownership of land. The state, Marx agrees, could take over landed property's sole essential function of keeping land from common use. See national parks. This could raise awkward questions about the private ownership of other means of production. Further, since land is in fact privately owned, it is bought as an investment or regarded as capital by its owners. As Marx says, the bourgeois himself has become the owner of land. See Harvey on mortgages of fictitious capital. It follows that landowners could come to regard themselves simply as capitalists and cease to act as a distinct class as a result. Even if they do, however, their perception does not abolish the difference between land and the other means of production, or between land and interest-bearing capital, any more than the idea of human capital makes workers into capitalists. While other means of production can be produced by capital and money, as a form of capital, land remains external to capital. Setting aside the question whether private land ownership is necessary and proceeding on the assumption that it exists, Marx's rent theory is intended to specify the portion of surplus value that landowners can seize. Now, landowners seize surplus value merely by withholding land from use unless rent is paid. This is the Ricardian notion. This withholding is their sole action. This is a permanent means of capturing surplus value from capital because capital must use but cannot produce land. It is true that the barrier established by landed property can be partially circumvented in various ways. The effectiveness of a given land area can be increased in agriculture by more productive methods of cultivation, for natural resource extraction, by the development of synthetics, and in building by high-rise construction. As Marx argues in connection with absolute rent, these alternatives to increasing the extent of land use affect how much surplus value landed property can capture. Still, capital must use some land. And since landowners can prevent this use, they have no reason to allow it without receiving some payment. It follows that all land in use commands some rent. In other words, zero rent land, on which Ricardo's rent theory is based, is incompatible with the private ownership of land. In addition, the quantity of land, in the sense that matters for economics, is not the quantity given by nature, but the supply of land on the market. This quantity is restricted so that every parcel in use extracts rent. In other words, land is scarce, or as Ricardo says, not unlimited in quantity because it is privately owned. Ruling out the possibility of zero rent land opens the way in turn to Marx's explanation for the price of land. This is based on the same principle as the explanation earlier in Capital Volume 3 of the price of financial assets. Land and financial assets are both claims to future incomes. The prices of both are derived backwards from these incomes by capitalization. That is, they correspond to the amount of capital that would yield the given amount of income at the prevailing rate of interest. Since both kinds of income, that is, interest and rent, result from the division of surplus value or surplus value captured from true capitals, Marx's explanation for these prices is consistent with his theory of value. There remains a problem regarding unused land. It plays an essential role since withholding some land from use may be the precondition for extracting rent on the rest. Unused land commands no rent, but to keep up the appearance of land as a commodity must have a price nevertheless. In accordance with the principle of uniform price, Marx argues that land with the same characteristics has the same price, whether or not it's rented out. With a price assigned to all land, the landowner appears as an investor or capitalist rather than a passive bystander, and rent appears as the return for his equivalent rather than as tribute, something obtained for nothing. Under capitalist conditions, the landowner rents to a capitalist producer, for example, to a capitalist farmer. One of Marx's chief concerns is to identify the particular form of conflict that the lease relationship entails, given that it involves the capitalist's use of another's private property and land. As he argues, two factors make the length of the lease a focus of conflict. The first has to do with permanent improvements in land. Permanent, meaning that capital is incorporated with the land and cannot be detached from it at the end of the lease. The capitalist, as the overseer of production and owner of capital, is the one to make improvements. In some cases, these are unavoidably associated with the use of land. Marx claims, for example, that cultivation by itself constitutes an improvement, transforming the earth from a mere raw material into earth capital. Once made, permanent improvements are characteristics of the land, that is, its new natural fertility, because they are inseparable from it. As such, they belong to the landowner at the end of the lease. Worst yet for the capitalist, since the land has been improved, its owner can command a higher rent in the next lease. For Marx, this is one of the greatest obstacles to a rational agriculture created by landed property. It induces the capitalist to keep permanent improvements to a minimum. The more so, the shorter the lease. The length of the lease matters in this connection because by the end of a long lease, the capital spent on improvements may be fully depreciated and recovered by the capitalist. Now, the second reason for conflict over the length of the lease has to do with the process of innovation. As in industry proper, agricultural methods of production change constantly as capital searches for lower cost techniques that will add to profits. In industry, the innovating capitalist captures surplus profit until the new technique is generalized. In agriculture, the capitalist innovator captures surplus profits only until the end of the current lease. In the next lease, all surplus profit, whatever its source, is transformed into differential rent and captured by the landowner. If the lease expires before a new technique is generalized, the agricultural innovator forgoes surplus profits that an industrial innovator would have kept. The agricultural capitalist, therefore, must divide the spoils of innovation with the landlord. The terms of this division depending on the length of the lease. The longer the lease, the greater the share captured by the capitalist. The foregoing expands on Marx's characterization of landed property. Landowners are passive beneficiaries of the development of production because they capture the surplus value resulting from permanent improvements and technological change. Capital investment for either purpose creates a tendency for rent to rise, which, if realized, leads in turn to an increase in the price of land. By this account, the pressure for rent to rise comes from both, number one, the technological change inherent in capital, and number two, how closely rent adjustments keep pace with this change, as determined by the standard length of the lease. As with the length of the working day, Marx argues that the length of the lease depends on the relative power of the landowner and the agricultural capitalist. The amount of rent, as will be shown below, is determined in principle by the extra surplus value generated by agricultural production at the time a new lease is negotiated. Now, Section 2, the formation of extra surplus value and its transformation into rent. Landed property cannot, in principle, withhold normal profits from the agricultural capitalist without driving capital out of the agricultural sector. Further, since landed property is not engaged in value creation, it can only withhold extra surplus value that capital generates of its own accord. By this reasoning, Marx confines rent to the two pockets of extra surplus value that result from competition among capital. First, extra surplus value exists within one industry because firms differ in productivity, while competition establishes one price for their product. Second, it exists before it is redistributed by the formation of the general rate of profit in those industries whose composition of capital is relatively low and whose product, therefore, has a value greater than its price of production. As these are the only sources of extra surplus value delimited by Marx's value schema, he treats them as the origin of the only normal forms of rent. The first is the source of differential rent, which, as we will see, has two forms, 1 and 2, and the second of absolute rent. The transformation of extra surplus value into rent only involves its seizure from capitalists by landlords. This would be simple if extra surplus value could be easily identified and were fixed independently of the landlord's intervention. As will emerge, however, this is true only in the case of the first form of differential rent. Before turning to the forms of rent, these forms of rent, a comment is in order about the problems posed by this aspect of Marx's argument and how they will be handled. Reflecting the unfinished state of capital, Volume 3, Marx explains the quantitative determination of rent entirely by way of examples, that is, using rent tables. Further, these yield conclusions only if they are bolstered by a host of assumptions, for example, about the price of agricultural output, the length of the lease, the proportion of total output produced with each type of soil. Throughout this mass of cases and conditions, Ricardo is the ever-present adversary. The attraction of Ricardo's account for Marx, which makes it worth opposing, is that it incorporates rent into value theory. Everything else from Ricardo, Marx discards as either, number one, arbitrary because it's based on a false natural determinacy, or number two, inconsistent with the private ownership of land. Marx's alternative to Ricardo's explanation of differential rent is meant to correct the first defect and his theory of absolute rent to correct the second. In keeping with Marx's guiding purpose, the focus here will be on the conceptual revisions he introduces to correct these errors in Ricardo. 2.1, differential rent. The place to begin with is with the theory of differential rent, since it will supply a way of determining the amount of absolute rent. As already noted, differential rent arises from productivity differences among firms. In agriculture, these arise from two sources, from the characteristics of land, fertility, and location, and from differences in production technique as in industry proper. Classifying differential rent by these two sources, Marx calls the first differential rent 1, D1, and the second differential rent 2, D2. Only the first form of differential rent, therefore, depends on features of production that are unique to agriculture, characteristics of land. To isolate the value consequences of these characteristics, Marx starts with the same assumption as Ricardo, that all agricultural capitalists use the same quantity of capital. Now, it's not until Marx considers differences in production technique in conjunction with differential rent 2 that he realizes that this assumption has a different meaning in his framework than in Ricardo's. As he comes to see by the same quantity of capital phrase, Marx really means the normal average amount of capital that is characteristic of the industry and that corresponds to the dominant technique of production. This means that the theory of differential rent 1 abstracts from differences in technique to assume that all firms are using the technique that is normal at any given time. Marx's reformulation of Ricardo's assumption is crucial as it holds the key to refuting Ricardo's natural laws, whereas Ricardo conceives of fertility as natural, as he says, the original and indestructible powers of the soil. Marx maintains throughout, even before he explicitly reformulates Ricardo's assumption, that fertility always involves an economic relation, a relation to the given level of agricultural development. See Marx's interest in soil science. The level of development, in the meaning Marx eventually gives it, is the composition of capital corresponding to the normal technique. Marx's insight is that fertility, in the sense that is relevant to agriculture at least, is not the objective characteristics of the soil, but the consequences of these characteristics for agricultural productivity. Since no land yields any product without a capital investment, land can only be ranked as more productive or less productive or fertile relative to some technique of production. The technique that sets the standard is the one that is normal at any given time. Moreover, as Marx emphasizes, in the context of developed capitalism, even the objective properties of the soil are not natural, but the result of permanent improvements. Since fertility both depends on the technique of production and is created by permanent improvements, it is socially created like location, land's other objective property. If, as Marx maintains, permanent improvements make land more uniform, then development should have the same leveling effect on fertility as it does on location. Revising the concept of fertility supplies Marx with his first case against Ricardo's law of declining agricultural productivity, rising rents, and falling profits. If fertility is not fixed once and for all by nature, but is relative to a standard production technique, then fertility changes as production techniques change. As Marx demonstrates by citing actual instances, new technologies need not have the same effect on different soil types. Technical change does not just improve fertility, but rearranges the fertility hierarchy that determines differential rent. With a new technique, soil types may change both their position in the fertility hierarchy and their degree of difference within that hierarchy. In particular, a new technique may transform soil that was previously not arable into the best type of land. Hence, the progress of cultivation towards ever worse soil is not a law, as Ricardo maintains. Nor is there any foundation for his inverse relation between rent and profit. For example, according to Marx, the case that is shown by experience to be the general rule is that new technology has the greatest effect on better land types, increasing their degree of difference from nor is there any foundation for his inverse relation between rent and profit. For example, according to Marx, the case that is shown by experience to be the general rule is that new technology has the greatest effect on better land types, increasing their degree of difference from inferior soil. Under these conditions, rent would increase without a rise in the price of agricultural output, which is still determined by cost of production on the worse soil. If the price of agricultural output remains the same, or even falls if inferior land is taken out of cultivation, wages do not rise. Therefore, profit does not fall. Since capitalism abandons traditional methods of production and constantly revises production techniques, rearrangements of the soil hierarchy are not accidental or exceptional. Thus, the rankings of different soil types and differentials between them are not fixed over time. This means that no law follows from differential rent 1, and so from characteristics of land, dictating the course of rent over time. Further, as the example just given illustrates, the course of rent has no direct impact on the course of profits. All that remains from Ricardo is that at any given moment there is a fertility hierarchy, which shows differences in productivity and in surplus value per acre of land. Because these differences are associated with distinct pieces of land, the formation of extra surplus value and its transformation into rent, that is, seizure by the landlord, are identical. This simple principle does not apply to the other forms of rent. With the second form of differential rent, Marx is concerned with productivity differences between successive investments of capital on the same land. Whereas with the first form of differential rent, one technique is taken as normal across all land types. With the second form, what is at issue is the transformation from one normal technique to another normal technique, as successive innovations are introduced, generalized, and supplanted. Now, although Marx superimposes technical change on the hierarchy of soil types, differential rent, too, has to do with the accumulation process of capital, not with the characteristics of land. Since, as an industry proper, the prospect of higher profits drives the accumulation process, technical change moves towards increased labor productivity, that is, lower labor costs, and therefore a rising organic composition of capital. As technological innovation proceeds, the effect of capital investment overwhelms differences in natural characteristics of land. Capital, which in this sense is synonymous with the means of production already produced, becomes the decisive element in cultivation. With this, the only difference between capitalist agriculture and capitalist industry is that the landowner stands ready to capture any excess profits. The chapters on the second form of differential rent are the most convoluted in all of Part 6, but some key points do emerge. One of the main principles Marx wants to establish is that rent per acre increases, and so also the price of land, with the investment of capital. His case for this principle seems to be that, as in industry, the accumulation of capital is the driving force underlying increasing productivity. In agriculture, the accumulation process would involve an increased concentration of capital on the same area of land, and so a rise in rent per acre. It seems also that Marx wants to establish this principle because it would put the final flourish on his critique of Ricardo. Beyond his negative case that rent does not rise because of Ricardo's original powers of the soil, Marx would establish that it rises instead because of the action of capital. Differential rent, however, does not depend just on productivity, but on a multiplicity of factors. As a result, Marx can demonstrate that rent rises with the intensity of capital only under specific conditions, but not as a general rule. To take a simple case, if additional capital is invested on every land type, for example, because the normal technique has changed, rent would increase because output per acre has increased, provided that the price of output remains the same and the productivity differentials between land types are preserved. Marx can argue that Ricardo's law requires even more restrictive conditions and that these conditions are empirically unlikely, but he cannot free his own principle from qualifications. Moreover, he does not need to. His fundamental point is that rent depends on capital, not that it rises as capital investment increases. He has already established several senses in which this is true. An extra surplus value, rent results from competition. Rent results from competition, since it presupposes a rate of profit, and so from the interaction of capitals. Differential rent 1 depends on fertility, which is a relation that involves the technique of production, and so capital as one of its elements. The new meaning to emerge with differential rent 2 is that rent depends on the innovation process inherent in capital. Since this perpetually increases the organic composition of capital, its result is that capital becomes ever more dominant. Now, while this appears to be Marx's main point, several other principles emerge in connection with differential rent too. First, the extra product resulting from successive investments of capital, for example, marginal products, are blurred and can no longer be recognized or distinguished. This is because the capitalist producer is concerned with the total output produced with the total capital investment, that i.e. with the average product of capital going all the way back for Marx. It follows that the differentials arising from successive investments of capital are hard to identify. As a result, the transformation of extra surplus value into rent becomes a matter of chance. For example, whether the timing of the lease enables the landowner to capture the surplus profits generated with one technique before techniques change again. Second, already existing rents may limit the extent to which the intensity of capital per acre can be increased. For example, if average productivity decreases with successive investments of capital in the absence of rent, capital intensity could be increased on better lands until the cost of production rose, i.e., productivity fell to the same level as that on the worst land, which sets the market price. Now, once a particular productivity differential on better land is captured in rents, however, it cannot be reduced by further investments of capital, since rents will not be rolled back. Under these conditions, already established rents block increased intensity of capital, a point Ben Fine emphasizes and will come up again in connection with absolute rent. If the limitation this places on the output of better lands keeps worse lands under cultivation to fill the total demand, it keeps the price of agricultural output high. Rent would then be responsible for the high price of agricultural output, contrary to Ricardo. In addition, and more important than scoring another point against Ricardo, landed property intervenes in and modifies the innovation process of capital. Third, and also relevant to absolute rent, the interaction between the two forms of differential rent may give rise to differential rent on the worst land. This is the case, for example, if in the face of increased demand for output, productivity on the worst land is higher than the productivity resulting from the use of additional capital on better land. Because the latter sets the market price, the former yields surplus profit. With this, all cultivated land would bear rent in the sense of simple differential rent. (2.2) Absolute rent. Marx is originally convinced of the necessity for absolute rent by the mistakes that follow from Ricardo's exclusion of it. To establish that rent does not affect the price of output, Ricardo argues that all rent is differential and that price is set by zero rent land. In the context of capitalism, however, rent presupposes landed property, and it in turn precludes the free use of land. To avoid this logical impossibility in Ricardo's theory, Marx incorporates absolute rent into his own, attributing it to the only remaining potential source of extra surplus value, that which agriculture would generate if the composition of capital were lower in agriculture than in industry. Marx's case that privately owned land cannot be used for free implies that rent must be paid regardless of the organic composition of capital. Rent must be paid regardless of the organic composition of capital, just as it must be paid regardless of productivity differences, as Marx argues against Ricardo. Marx allows that rent could be based on a pure monopoly price, meaning an output price greater than both price of production and value. He rejects this option, though, because it implies that rent enters the price of agricultural output as an element independent of its value. Alternatively, he excludes monopoly price from Capital, Volume 3, because It belongs to the theory of competition. Now, while Marx's critique of Ricardo is valid, his theory of absolute rent is questionable. Most obviously, Marx's absolute rent depends on whether the organic composition of capital is in fact lower in agriculture than in industry. Marx argues that this is historically true because of the earlier and more rapid development of the mechanical sciences. But a later start does not mean permanent backwardness. In his effort to save this aspect of Marx's theory, Ben Fine emphasizes Marx's case in connection with differential rent 2, that landed property may block the use of additional capital, thereby preventing an increase in organic composition by refusing to lower already established differential rents. Marx has proposed other more straightforward impediments to capital investment in agriculture, that permanent improvements both become the landowner's property and raise rent, and that innovation generates less great extra profit for the agricultural capitalist than for the industrial capitalist. Still, as Marx acknowledges, none of these guarantee that agriculture will be forever relatively backward. Further, since the requirement to pay rent does not vanish with a rise in the agricultural organic composition of capital, there is nothing to guarantee that absolute rent will remain within the limits that Marx sets. A second and simpler issue is that Marx gains nothing by positing a relatively low agricultural organic composition of capital. If the price of agricultural output is above the price of production, whether it is below or above value makes no difference. In either case, it is a price established against and in spite of the competitive pressure to equalize the rate of profit. In both cases, also, price is, quote, independent of value, unquote, in the sense that Marx does not avoid having to appeal to supply and demand to explain it. He grants that a price below or equal to value but above price of production is a monopoly price, but distinguishes this from a genuine monopoly price, one that is above value as well as price of production. From the standpoint of the forces that establish price, however, this is a distinction without a difference. The whole problem of the organic composition of capital and of different kinds of monopoly price arises because Marx wants to keep rent from being an element independent of its commodity's value. Now, this, however, is Ricardo's problem. It is a condition imposed on the explanation of rent by Ricardo's theory of value. It should never have become an issue for Marx. Maintaining that the price exceeds the value of agricultural output would not undermine Marx's version of the theory of value, although it would undermine Ricardo's theory of the version of the theory of value. It would just mean that the agricultural sector withdraws from, rather than contributes to, the pool of surplus value that all capital shares. Now, appealing to supply and demand does not contradict value theory either. Marx is not bothered by it when he explains the division of surplus value between interest and profit of enterprise by the supply and demand for money capital. Finally, Marx does present another solution to the determination of absolute rent. In a second line of argument, he maintains that absolute rent can only be small in normal conditions. Marx adds, whatever the excess value of the product over its price of production. He means that rent may not capture the entire excess, but the point applies even if there is no excess, regardless of the composition of capital. The reason is that the rent on any given piece of land is limited by the costs associated with the other ways of producing agricultural output that would remain if that piece of land were to be withdrawn from cultivation. For example, rent on a given piece of land cannot exceed the cost of producing more output by using more capital intensive methods, that is, by using more capital intensive methods on the other lands under cultivation. If it did, capitalists would adopt such methods and refuse to rent the piece of land in question. Marx reasons that since unrented land is economically worthless, owners will be willing to allow land to be used for a small rent, meaning the price of agricultural output need only rise slightly above the price of production. This fulfills the purpose Marx intended for the theory of absolute rent, namely to establish the impossibility of zero rent land. The small rent is based on the principle of differential cost, and Marx's argument for it is exactly the same as his case for differential rent on the worst land. Now, while this leaves no separate quantitative principle determining absolute rent, the valid point in Marx's argument for absolute rent is that ownership must have economic significance. In the case of land, this significance is enforced against capital by keeping land scarce, withholding its use. On this interpretation, Marx's argument for absolute rent is strikingly similar to Keynes's explanation for the yield on capital. The only reason why an asset offers a prospect for yielding during its life services having an aggregate value greater than its initial supply price is because it is scarce, and it is kept scarce because of the competition of the rate of interest on money. Thus, ultimately, for Keynes, capital has a yield because the special properties of money prevent the rate of interest from falling to zero. The parallel case in Marx is that the private ownership of land makes land scarce and so prevents rent from falling to zero. Conclusion: it has been argued that Marx's chief objective in the theory of rent is to identify the relations of production associated with the use of land in capitalism and to establish these in place of Ricardo's original powers of the soil as the determinants of rent. This chapter has focused on the principal ways in which Marx achieves this objective. Regarding the relations themselves, he argues that the dominance of capital assigns a purely economic form to land ownership. Now, echoing his description of the wage contract, he examines how the conflict between capital and landed property plays out in the lease contract. In connection with the first form of differential rent, Marx redefines fertility as the relation between the objective characteristics of land and the normal technique of production. In connection with the second form of differential rent, he examines the implications for rent of capital's process of technological innovation. While his argument on absolute rent is flawed, its flaws do not affect Marx's chief point. This is that the meaning of capitalist private property is the command over value. Now, this ends chapter 10, and in the in the collection of essays on volume 3, Shepard and Rutten, and we'll get to the next chapter supposedly next week. We'll see. The point is that these are all preparations for the discussion in the CSSGJ series that we hope will happen in the fall. Andy Higginbottom's lectures for them on volume 3 to hopefully finish off the analysis of these lectures on the 3 volumes of Capital. And I hope that will happen. I may even send a note to him to see whether this is going to happen, because I think we are expecting that in an interesting way. Tomorrow we may or may not continue, although I think actually because of the timing of other matters, we may actually cancel the Monday this and that for a variety of reasons. So on Tuesday, we may perhaps continue the 30 lecture series on Anwar Sheikh's 4 C's, the competition, capital crisis, and et cetera. So we'll see. Let me thank you for your attention, and I will stop this so that we can move on to struggle sessions. Not here, but over on Adnan Hussein's site. So let me thank you for your attention yet again, and I will be shutting off